At 12:14 p.m. on August the 9th, 1941, a single Spitfire M-Cavar bored through thin white cloud over northern France, sunlight burning off the canopy, exhausts tracing faint brown smears against the summer sky. Inside the cockpit, Group Captain Douglas Bader shoved the stick over into a hard brake turn, the world tilting until the channel lay on its side and the fields of Pas-de-Calais spun in a green and brown carousel far beneath his wings. The G-forces clawed at his body, trying to drag his shoulders down into the seat, but where most pilots felt fire and pressure as blood drained out of their legs, Bader felt nothing at all. His feet were aluminium. His lower legs were leather and steel. The straps around his thighs held tight. The Spitfire's rudder bar moved under the locked clamp of artificial feet that could not cramp, could not shake, could not tremble. Ahead and above, a scatter of dark crosses slashed across the sun. Messerschmitt Bf-129s from JG-26 rolled in out of their perch, diving with the easy confidence of men fighting over their own territory. They had altitude, numbers, and the advantage of the sun. Bader had a wing of Spitfires strung out behind him, fuel burning fast, and the knowledge that every minute spent over France was a minute stolen from the Luftwaffe's hunting ground and borrowed against British lives on the ground far to the north. He eased the nose up just enough to spoil the enemy's firing pass, kicked the metal legs against the bar, and flung the entire aircraft into a climbing turn that would have blacked out many men still reliant on flesh and bone. The first 109 flashed past underneath, tracer reaching just behind. The second overshot and tried to pull up into a steep climbing roll, but the Spitfire was already there, gun buttons depressed under gloved thumbs, 8 303 Brownings hammering in a steady, carefully measured burst. Grey paint, black crosses, and glass turned into fragments, then into smoke, then into a burning spiral that bored into the patchwork of fields and hedges below. One more mark in a combat report that already carried 21 others. One more German fighter falling away from a man who was never supposed to fly again. Then the sky changed. A shape loomed in Bader's canopy, too close, too fast. Somewhere behind his head, a voice crackled over RT that he could not quite catch, drowned in the roar of Merlin and the shriek of airflow. A shock ran through the airframe as metal met metal. The Spitfire lurched, spun, shuddered. The starboard wingtip vanished into a sudden spray of debris. Control responses went thick and sluggish. The aircraft rolled onto its back, nose dropping toward France, and something inside the cockpit snapped hard around his right stump. One prosthetic leg jammed under the instrument panel, trapping him in a dying machine that no longer cared whether its pilot had bone or steel below the knees. Below, anti-aircraft bursts walked up through the sky. The altimeter unwound. Fuel streamed in a shining arc from a ruptured wing tank. Bader hammered at the leg straps, wrestling to free the trapped metal limb as the Spitfire spun downward in a tightening, murderous corkscrew. For a few long seconds, the man credited with 22 victories over German aircraft was no longer wing leader or national symbol, just another pilot upside down in a broken fighter, fighting not the Luftwaffe, but his own artificial body for a chance to live long enough to fall into captivity. But to understand how a man with no legs ended up leading one of Fighter Command's most aggressive Spitfire wings into the teeth of the Luftwaffe, and how he shot down 22 enemy aircraft after medicine had written him off as useless, it is necessary to go back a decade, to the day the Royal Air Force decided it had no further use for Douglas Bader. In December 1931, there was no war in Europe, only peacetime boredom and the dangerous competitive energy of young RAF officers who considered low-level aerobatics a form of conversation. Douglas Bader was 21 years old, a Cranwell-trained pilot officer with more confidence than caution, already known across mess halls for rugby tackles that hit like artillery and aerobatic displays that pushed regulations past breaking point. That winter, at Woodley Airfield near Reading, he drove a Bristol Bulldog fighter into a low-altitude roll that left no margin for error. The left wingtip clipped the ground, the aircraft cartwheeled in a spray of torn metal and spilled fuel. When it stopped moving, the cockpit was a silent, crumpled thing in the frost. Surgeons at the Royal Berkshire Hospital made the decisions that pilots fear more than flak or fire. One leg went above the knee, the other below. Infection risk, circulation, future mobility, all weighed against the damage. When the bandages were finally changed and the swelling went down, the man who would one day lead a wing of Spitfires looked down and saw only bandaged stumps where muscle and bone had been. The RAF Medical Board followed quickly. Flying, in their view, required 2 real legs for rudder control and emergency egress. An officer with no legs could be admired, pitied, even posted to a desk, but he could not be trusted with a fighter aircraft. Bader was invalided out of the service in 1933, his flying career officially over before the world had even begun to slide toward war. In the quiet civilian years that followed, the thing that would later shape his tactics over Britain took no form that looked remotely like innovation. It looked like frustration and repetition. Bader was fitted with a pair of heavy, awkward prosthetic legs at RAF Uxbridge, crude metal and leather devices that bit into raw flesh and responded badly to clumsy weight shifts. Learning to use them was not inspiration, it was grind. He walked the length of hospital corridors again and again until the stumps bled. He fell down, stood up, fell again. Nurses watched in uneasy silence as the former pilot turned each stumble into another drill. Ordinary tasks became exercises in balance and timing. Descending stairs meant breaking each movement into deliberate segments, trusting the artificial joints to lock at the right instant. Driving a car demanded a different kind of pressure on pedals, less feeling and more memory. In golf swings and social dances and everyday climbs onto buses, he taught a badly designed machine to respond as if it had nerves. The experience carved something into him that no flying school could have provided. It demanded a hatred of compromise and a near scientific obsession with repetition until muscles, or what was left of them, moved perfectly on command. The same mind that had once treated low-level roles as a game now treated walking across a room as a campaign. Success meant acknowledging what the prosthetics could not do and ruthlessly exploiting what they could. Artificial legs could not feel surfaces, but they did not tire in the same way. They could lock hard against pressure and hold positions that would have cramped living calf muscles. Their limits were different, and if their user learned those limits intimately enough, they were something more than a disability. By 1939, Europe no longer had patience for peacetime experiments. German armies walked through Poland. The Luftwaffe proved over and over that modern air power could break nations in weeks, not years. In Britain, the RAF scrambled to expand. Training fields filled with young men in blue, and somewhere inside Douglas Bader, a simple calculation surfaced. If artificial legs could learn to dance and drive, they could learn to fly. He used old connections from Cranwell, pushed, argued, refused to accept the conclusion that bone and muscle lost 8 years earlier disqualified him from a cockpit in a country desperate for pilots. RAF bureaucracy resisted, then relented, then tested. In February 1940, at the age of 29, noticeably older than most of the boys arriving straight from training, Bader was back on operational strength, strapping into the narrow cockpit of a Supermarine Spitfire with his new legs clamped onto the rudder bar. The machine he climbed into was, in theory, the answer to Britain's peril. The Spitfire could outclimb and outturn the Messerschmitt Bf 109 at many altitudes, and its 8 Browning machine guns gave it a lethal punch. But aircraft performance meant little in the face of doctrine that did not match reality. In the spring and early summer of 1940, as France collapsed and the British Expeditionary Force bled men and equipment back across the Channel at Dunkirk, RAF Fighter Command faced a tactical problem that claimed aircrew faster than factories could replace aircraft. Squadrons flew in the tight Vic formation inherited from pre-war exercises. 3 fighters in a V, 3 Vs making a squadron, elegant in parades and hopeless in combat. Pilots spent more attention keeping their positions tidy than scanning the sky. German fighter units, hardened by campaigns over Poland and France, used looser, more flexible finger 4 formations that gave them superior lookout and mutual protection. Their Bf 109s rode higher than RAF patrol lines, diving in out of the sun with speed and altitude advantage, hitting Hurricanes and Spitfires as they tried to defend convoys and troopships below. For Fighter Command as an institution, the problem was one of radar plots and sector controllers, of how to position small numbers of fighters against large incoming raids. For Bader, newly assigned to squadron service, it narrowed into something more personal and immediate: how to keep inexperienced pilots alive long enough to learn when doctrine, formation patterns, and even the cockpit ergonomics had been designed around men who still had feeling in their feet and years of peacetime training behind them. His first taste of combat came in the thin, desperate days of Dunkirk. Flying Spitfires out of Duxford with No. 19 Squadron, he climbed through grey Channel haze to 30,000 feet, looking down at columns of smoke streaming up from ships and burning oil. On one patrol, he slid in behind a lone Bf 109 flying almost the same course and speed, a German pilot apparently unaware that a Spitfire had ghosted into his blind spot. There was no space for elaborate maneuvering, just a smooth lineup, a gentle squeeze on the gun button, splashes of fire along the Messerschmitt's fuselage, and then sky where an enemy had been. Days later, a Dornier bomber loomed in his sights, its dorsal gunner spitting tracer until a deflection shot silenced the gun and forced the bomber toward the sea. This was not innovation. It was survival and gradual proof that a man with artificial legs could fight in the same 3-dimensional knife fight as those who had never seen an amputation ward. The turning point came not over France but back in England, when Bader was given something more valuable than a single polished fighter: a squadron that had been nearly broken. At the end of June 1940, he was sent to command No. 242 Squadron, a Hurricane unit made up largely of Canadian pilots. They had been through the meat grinder of the Battle of France. Their casualty lists were long, their replacement pool green, their faith in higher command thin. They were officially a squadron on paper. In reality, they were a scattered group of tired, skeptical men operating tired machines. What Bader brought to them was not sympathy. It was the same relentless, repetitive discipline that had taken him from hospital bed to awkward steps to functional use of artificial legs. The squadron needed the equivalent of physiotherapy, but in the air. He cut through maintenance backlogs and red tape to get aircraft serviceable. He forced standardization of gun harmonization and engine settings. He insisted that every pilot fly the same drills until they were automatic. Takeoff in elements, transition from tight Vic to looser battle formation, break turns and repositioning done not as individual flourishes but as rehearsed choreography. The pattern was simple. The unit moved as one, covered for each other, attacked together, and broke off together. Lone heroics were discouraged. This approach did not look revolutionary on a blackboard. It looked like enforcement of basic discipline. The innovation lay in how rigorously it was enforced and in the way Bader connected it to an insight that had been hammered into him on wooden hospital floors. Complex movements become reflex only when repeated beyond boredom. The pilots of 242 Squadron did not just fly practice intercepts. They flew them until their bodies could execute them while minds were occupied with threat detection and fuel states. Each formation change was treated as a step on a staircase that had to be climbed without looking down. The first real test came in the hot, cloud-stacked days of late August 1940, as the Luftwaffe turned its attention from ports and convoys to airfields and cities. On one of those days, under a sky laced with contrails and smeared flak, Fighter Command controllers ordered Bader's rebuilt 242 Squadron into the air as part of 12 Groups' response to incoming raids. The squadron scrambled from Coltishall, wheels lifting from concrete, flaps retracting, Hurricanes clawing for altitude in a laddered climb. Inside each cockpit, the noise of the Merlin engine drowned out almost everything else. Instruments bounced, sweat gathered under oxygen masks. The formation climbed not as a messy stream, but as a single cohesive block, each pilot hitting the familiar positions they had flown in training. Bader's Hurricane led the central element. Artificial feet locked on the rudder bar, hands light on the stick. The squadron formed into its practiced battle spread as they approached the estimated interception point. Somewhere ahead, bombers and fighters were coming in across the Norfolk coast, bound for targets whose destruction would make the next day's scramble harder, perhaps impossible. When the German formation finally emerged from haze, 242 Squadron did not fragment into individual chases. It pivoted. The main body swung to attack the bombers, while sections peeled off in pairs and fours to occupy the escorting 109s. The pattern matched the drills. Bader drove straight for the heaviest concentration, trusting his pilots to do what the countless rehearsals had carved into reflex. Hurricanes carved into bomber boxes, guns chattering, tracers threading through air. Some aircraft failed to return because no tactic erased the fact that war was a numbers game measured in blood and aluminium. But the unit no longer fought as scattered individuals. It moved like a single organism, presenting the enemy with not targets but interlocked threats. Word spread up the chain of command that 242 Squadron, once considered shaky, was now among the most aggressive and efficient units in 12 Group. Its Canadian pilots gained reputations as sharp, reliable fighters. At the center of that transformation was a commander whose legs were strapped into the cockpit rather than grown into his hips. For ground crews and junior pilots, the sight of Bader swinging those artificial legs over the cockpit edge became something more than a curiosity. It was a daily reminder that excuses had no place in a unit whose leader had already been told by an entire medical board that he could not do the thing he now did every day. Success at the squadron level opened the door to a larger experiment. As the Battle of Britain intensified, a doctrinal argument simmered inside Fighter Command. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group favoured sending individual squadrons up quickly to meet raids as radar plots formed, accepting that his pilots would often be outnumbered, but valuing speed of response. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory of 12 Group preferred mass. His idea, developed with officers like Bader, involved assembling multiple squadrons into a big wing that could be hurled en masse at enemy formations, overwhelming bombers and escorts alike. On paper, the system was risky. Assembling 3 to 5 squadrons at altitude took time. Misjudged vectors could leave German bombers over targets unmolested, but when the timing worked, the effect was devastating. Bader, with his established record at 242, became one of the principal practitioners of this concept out of Duxford. He led composite formations, often including his own Hurricanes, Spitfires from No. 19 Squadron, and Czech pilots of No. 310 Squadron, into battles where dozens of RAF fighters dropped out of sun and cloud simultaneously. On days when everything clicked, German crews later described the experience as flying into a wall of aircraft and tracers that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The same mental wiring that had turned the pain of learning to walk again into a disciplined drill now drove Bader to refine these multi-squadron attacks in obsessive detail. Rendezvous altitudes, climbing turns after takeoff, the angles at which different squadrons would fall upon the German formation, all were rehearsed, briefed, and enforced. He insisted that his pilots stay in tight formation until the last possible moment, refusing to let excitement break the carefully constructed pattern. Once engaged, his orders emphasized aggression without chaos. Wingmen were not to abandon leaders for an enticing target. Leaders were to resist the urge to chase kills at the expense of formation integrity. This was not universally popular. Pilots from different national backgrounds and training pipelines chafed at the rigid control. Some senior officers questioned the big wing's claimed kill tallies, noting that in the swirling chaos of large engagements, overclaiming was almost inevitable. Subsequent analysis suggested that numbers credited to Bader's formations were indeed optimistic at times, but even after the exaggeration was stripped away, the impact remained clear. German losses on days when big wings intercepted were significant, and equally crucial, British bomber and fighter crews on the receiving end of Luftwaffe raids felt less alone. The sight of large formations of RAF fighters dropping in above them steadied nerves and stiffened resolve. By early 1941, the defensive Battle of Britain had given way to a more offensive posture. The Luftwaffe shifted focus to the Eastern Front and night raids, reducing pressure over southern England. RAF Fighter Command, now under Lee-Mallory's growing influence, began sending daylight circus operations over occupied France, small bomber formations escorted by large fighter wings, designed to attack targets of opportunity and, more importantly, to compel the remaining Jagdgeschwader in Western Europe into combat. Bader, promoted to wing commander and made one of the first official wing leaders, found himself at the tip of this new spear. From bases like Tangmere and back at Duxford, his aircraft now bore not just squadron codes, but his initials, DB, painted on the fuselage, a visible acknowledgement of both his status and his symbolic value. For ground crews and the public, the sight of those letters on a Spitfire flown by a man with prosthetic legs compressed a complex story into a simple message. Physical loss did not preclude frontline service. For Bader himself, the initials were simply reference points on an airframe that had to be handled with ruthless precision. Inside the cockpit, the advantages and drawbacks of his artificial legs were intimately felt. Because they did not suffer from pooled blood under G-load, he could sometimes sustain high G turns a fraction longer before greying out, relying on his upper body and core muscles to keep blood in the brain. At the same time, lack of sensation in his lower limbs meant that tiny slip indications and rudder feedback had to be read entirely through instruments and the seat of his pants, not through soles or calves. Over hundreds of hours, he tuned his inputs to compensate, turning what at first had seemed like an insurmountable handicap into a manageable set of constraints. His leadership style in the air matched his personality on the ground, direct, uncompromising and aggressive. Over occupied France, his wing frequently sought combat with experienced units like JG-26 and JG-2, meeting them over the Channel, over railroad junctions, over airfields whose flak batteries stitched to the sky with black puffs. The statistics accumulated. By August 1941, official tallies credited him with 22 enemy aircraft destroyed, putting him among the top RAF aces of the war to that point. Yet the same qualities that made him formidable also carried risk. Aggression could bleed into overconfidence. The lure of combat over enemy territory with its promise of further degrading. The Jagdwaffe and keeping pressure on German morale cut both ways. On that August day over northern France, when his Spitfire collided with another aircraft mid-battle, accounts differ on whether it was a German fighter or a friendly aircraft in the melee, the maths of risk finally turned against him. The collision tore away part of his machine, and the Spitfire became a crippled projectile dropping into hostile country. The problem inside the cockpit was brutally simple. To survive, a pilot had to abandon the aircraft before it ripped itself apart. Ejection seats did not exist in that era. Escape meant sliding back the canopy, releasing harnesses, and physically climbing out. For a man with both legs trapped, one prosthetic jammed under the instrument panel, the odds were catastrophically low. The habits learned in hospital corridors a decade before came back in the most lethal of classrooms. Bader tore at the straps, forced his body to twist against forces trying to pin him in place, and finally wrenched himself free, leaving one artificial leg behind in the cockpit as he bailed out. He floated down under a silk canopy into a landscape that had seen RAF fighters many times, but never one whose pilot carried only a single metal limb. German troops took him prisoner, surprised to find that the much-publicized Legless ace was not propaganda. One of the strangest episodes of the air war followed. German ace Adolf Galland, impressed by Bader's record and condition, arranged for a message to be sent through the International Red Cross offering safe conduct to a British aircraft to drop a replacement prosthetic leg. The RAF complied, fitting a wooden crate with a new limb into a bomber's bomb bay and releasing it by parachute over occupied territory before continuing on to attack other targets. The operation gained an unofficial nickname built around the obvious object inside the crate. The replacement leg arrived. So did Bader's instinctive refusal to accept confinement. Within days, he attempted escape from the hospital, improvising rope from bedsheets, dragging an artificial limb through windows and across courtyards, trying to make for safe houses and farmhouses promised by sympathetic locals. Each attempt ended in recapture. German guards, initially amused, eventually grew exasperated enough that more than once they confiscated his legs at night to prevent further attempts. It made little difference. The man who had once been told he would never fly again treated each failed escape not as discouragement, but as another drill, another iteration toward a successful run. Over the following years, as the air war shifted toward massed bombing campaigns, and new generations of pilots took their place in fighter command's rosters, Bader was moved from camp to camp, his reputation preceding him. Finally, the Germans delivered him to Oflag 4C, Colditz Castle, a medieval fortress perched above the River Mulde, reserved for those considered the highest escape risks. There, among other determined prisoners, his war settled into a new pattern of goading guards, planning tunnels, and maintaining a form of resistance that was as much psychological as physical. The artificial legs remained both hindrance and symbol, devices that could be used to climb, to hide contraband, or, when guards grew too irritated, to deny their owner mobility for a night at a time. When American forces reached Colditz in the spring of 1945, the man who had entered the war as a grounded invalid and then re-entered it as a legless fighter ace emerged from captivity with the same mix of bluntness and drive that had defined his pre-war and wartime years. In Paris, according to accounts, he requested a Spitfire to return immediately to combat and had to be refused. Peace would not bend even for a man who had already bent the rules of medicine and bureaucracy into new shapes. In the post-war decades, he worked in the aviation industry, campaigned for disabled rights in his own way, and became a public figure whose story was polished into books and films that inevitably simplified complex realities into inspirational narrative. The controversies outlived the war as well. Historians argued over the effectiveness of the Big Wing, over overclaimed victories, over whether fighter command's resources could have been better allocated. These debates touched his legacy because Bader had been one of the concept's most visible champions. Many pilots who flew under him remembered rigid control and uncompromising expectations that left little room for dissent. Others remembered a leader whose visible defiance of physical limitation gave them strength to climb into thin-walled cockpits day after day, knowing that the odds did not favor long careers. Both sets of memories were true. What remained impossible to argue with was the math. Between May 1940 and August 1941, Douglas Bader was officially credited with 22 aerial victories over German aircraft, alongside shared kills and damaged enemies. Those numbers placed him in the upper tier of RAF aces, but numbers alone did not capture the real impact of his presence. At a time when Britain's survival hinged on the willingness of young men to keep climbing into fighters despite casualty boards, the image of a man who had lost both legs in a peacetime crash, fought his way back into operational flying, and then led formations into battle had an effect that no training pamphlet could replicate. His story did not end at Colditz's gates or with peacetime honours. It persisted in less obvious ways, in the quiet decisions of later disabled veterans who pointed to an RAF group captain and concluded that their own injuries did not end their usefulness, in the design of prosthetics that took lessons from pilots who tested their limits in high-G environments, in the evolution of fighter doctrine that acknowledged the importance of flexible formations and mutual support that had been enforced so ruthlessly in his squadrons. In the decades after his death in 1982, researchers, historians, and enthusiasts re-examined his record, stripping away myth where necessary, but the core remained stubborn and metallic, much like the man himself. The last chapter of the August 1941 sortie that opened this story was written in a prisoner of war camp, not in the skies over France. The Spitfire that had carried him through so many combats fell to earth without its pilot, one artificial leg still jammed inside. The man who had flown it watched from under a parachute canopy as other aircraft on both sides twisted and fell, the battle continuing briefly without him before fading into the normal rhythm of war. In that moment, he was no longer wing leader, no longer symbol, not yet prisoner. He was simply a man suspended between past and future, between the accident that had taken his legs and the campaigns that would be fought without him. For those who look back across the intervening years, it is tempting to smooth his story into a clean arc: tragedy, perseverance, triumph. The reality was rougher, louder, and more ambiguous. It involved arguments with superiors, doctrinal disputes, and the hard truth that innovation in war rarely comes from pristine laboratories. It comes from people forced to solve problems with the backgrounds they already possess. For Douglas Bader, those backgrounds included rugby pitches, hospital corridors, and endless stubborn practice walking on legs that did not feel. The innovations he brought to fighter command were not always his alone, nor always uncontested. Finger four tactics, big wings, and aggressive leadership all had other authors, but he became one of the clearest embodiments of a single dangerous idea: that limitations accepted by institutions could be overturned by individuals willing to live with discomfort and risk. A legless pilot in a cramped Spitfire cockpit, hauling a fighter into turns that tested both metal and flesh, leading tight formations into skies dominated by a confident enemy, was not supposed to exist. Yet there he was, and 22 Luftwaffe aircraft never came home because of it. Most people know the phrase "legless ace" and the polished legend of the man behind it. Fewer know the grind of practice, the tactical obsession, the doctrinal battles and literal crashes that made that legend possible. For anyone tracing contrails back through time, the silhouette of a Spitfire crossing the English coast in 1940 now carries a clearer shape in its cockpit. A pilot who refused to accept the finality of a medical report and instead turned prosthetic limbs into part of the weapon system. Most accounts remember his name already, but the details of how he fought and how he thought belong to the present as much as the past.